Okay, so today we're going to be talking about the 12 cranial nerves of the brain, starting with the olfactory nerve, um, uh, cranial nerve 1. It is typically considered the first cranial nerve. It contains sensory nerve fibers relating to the sense of smell. The afferent nerve fibers of the olfactory receptor neurons transmit nerve impulses about odors to the central nervous system. These nerves arise in the olfactory receptors of the nasal epithelium and pass through holes of the cribriform plate to reach the olfactory bulb on the ventral brain surface. The olfactory tracts lead from these bulbs back to the thalamus and then to the frontal lobe for smell perception. Moving to cranial nerve 2 is the optic nerve. It contains sensory-only nerves for vision. It is a paired cranial nerve that transmits visual information from the retina to the brain. These fibers arise from the retina at the optic disc and travel to the optic chiasma, where about half of them will cross over. From there, the optic tracts take impulses to the thalamus, which relays them to the visual cortex in the occipital lobe and the visual reflex sensor in the midbrain. The optic nerve is derived during the 7th week of development and is composed of retinal ganglion, cell axons, and glial cells. Moving to cranial nerve 3, the oculomotor, it is considered as the eye mover. It contains motor nerves to the extrinsic and the intrinsic eye muscles. It moves 4 of the 6 muscles, which include the superior, the medial, the inferior rectus, and the inferior oblique. Its parasympathetic fibers control muscles of the iris for constricting the pupil and the ciliary muscles for accommodation of the lens for near vision. It enters the orbit through the superior orbital fissure and innervates extrinsic eye muscles that enable most movements of the eye and that raise the eyelid. It's actually the first of the parasympathetic fibers. Alrighty, the 4th cranial nerve is a trochlear. It is a motor nerve, a somatic efferent nerve, and it innervates just one muscle, the superior oblique muscle of the eye, which operates through the pulley-like trochleae, which actually gave the nerve its name. So the tendon of the muscle passes through the pulley-like ligament, and it is considered the smallest nerve in terms of number of axons it contains. The trochlear nerve is unique among the other cranial nerves in several aspects. So, for example, it has the greatest intracranial length. It is the only cranial nerve that exits from the dorsal rear aspect of the nerve. It innervates a muscle, the superior oblique muscle, on the opposite side from its nucleus. The trochlear nerve decussates within the brainstem before emerging on the contralateral side of the brainstem, and an injury to the trochlear nucleus in the brainstem will result in a contralateral superior oblique muscle palsy, whereas an injury to the trochlear nerve after it's emerged from the brainstem, it will result in a ipsilateral superior oblique muscle palsy. The 5th cranial nerve is a trigeminal nerve. It can be spotted on the brain because the neurons look like triplets together. It's sometimes called the great sensory nerve of the face. It is both the largest and the most complex of the cranial nerves. Its name derives from each of the 2 nerves, so each on one side of the pons, having 3 major branches: the ophthalmic nerve, the maxillary nerve, and the mandibular nerve. From these, it receives sensations of a conscious nature, touch, temperature, and pain, and it controls the muscles for chewing. Alrighty, moving on to the 6th cranial nerve. It is the abducens nerve. It is also known as the abducent nerve, so it moves the last of the eye muscles. It controls the movement of the lateral rectus muscle, and it is responsible for outward blaze. It is a somatic efferent nerve, and it has no sensory function compared to the oculomotor and the trochlear nerve. Moving on to the 7th cranial nerve is the facial nerve, and it is the chief motor nerve of the face. Its branches extend to muscles of facial expression. It contains sensory nerves for taste from the anterior 2/3 of tongue, and it also sends out parasympathetic fibers to lacrimal and salivary glands. Its 5 major branches controlling facial expression include the temporal, zygomatic, buccal, mandibular, and cervical. It emerges from the pons of the brainstem. The nerves typically travel from the pons through the facial canal in the temporal bone, and it exits the skull at the stylomastoid foramen. Also, it supplies preganglionic parasympathetic fibers to several head and neck ganglia. The eighth cranial nerve is the vestibulocochlear. It is also known as the auditory acoustic or the statoacoustic nerve. This nerve carries stimuli from the inner ear into the brain for perception of hearing and balance. So through the avicochlear fibers, it also transmits motor and modulatory information from the superior olivary complex in the brainstem to the cochleae. Moving on to the ninth cranial nerve is the glossopharyngeal. It is a mixed nerve that carries afferent sensory and efferent motor information. It exits the brainstem out from the sides of the upper medulla, just anterior, which is close to the nose, to the vagus. So the motor division of the glossopharyngeal nerve is derived from the basal plate of the embryonic medulla oblongata, while the sensory division originates from the cranial neural crest. It contains motor nerves to the pharyngeal muscles for swallowing and parasympathetic fibers to the parotid salivary gland. It contains sensory nerves from taste buds on the posterior tongue, and as well as other conscious sensations from the outer ear. It is also important in the sensory pathways for control of blood pressure and respiration. So the cranial nerve is the vagus. It is historically cited as the pneumogastric nerve. It is the parasympathetic nerve to the viscera. Its fibers send stimuli to the pharynx for swallowing, to the larynx for speech, to the heart, stomach, intestines, bronchi, and virtually every other parasympathetic effector between the head and the pelvis. The vagus also provides sensory input, especially important to the respiratory reflex, and it is the longest nerve of the autonomic nervous system in the human body. The 11th cranial nerve, is the accessory nerve. It is a cranial nerve that supplies the sternocleidomastoid and the trapezius muscles. It is involved in head, neck, and shoulder movements, and it also sends fibers to the pharynx for swallowing as well. And last but not least, the hypoglossal, the 12th cranial nerve. It innervates all the extrinsic and intrinsic muscles of the tongue, except for the palatoglottis, and which is innervated by the vagus nerve. It is solely motor function. The nerve arises from the hypoglossal nucleus in the medulla as a number of small rootlets passes through the hypoglossal canal and down the neck, and it eventually passes up again over the tongue muscles that it supplies to. And that will be all for this video. I thank you guys for watching, and I hope you have a better understanding of the cranial nerves. Thank you so much. Goodbye.